Good morning. I've been hanging around a church long enough that I know when you see someone new up here, you probably have a couple questions this morning. One, who is this guy? And two, will I get out in time to see the final round of the Masters? Casey helped you with the first question. I'll do my best on the second one, but I think we have a few hours before the big guys tee off a little bit later. I want to, again, as Casey said, my name is Dominic. You can call me Dom either way. My wife and I live here in Charlotte. She's with her parents this morning and sends her regards. We have gotten to know Tanya and Casey and just love who they are, love their heart and passion for Jesus, and have heard great things about what God's doing here. So it's such a privilege. It's really an honor to come and serve you this morning, and so glad to be here. Again, the little Casey just said it. I spent the last 9 years, the last 4 of those 9 years in France, in the ministry in France. Unbelievable time. I'd love to share more with you later, as we were sharing earlier with the worship team. God's doing incredible things in Europe, in a place full of need to hear the gospel. So I was a pastor there, among other things, back now as God's called us back to the States and to use what we've learned there here in ministry here. So in this interim time, back working in business, where I was before I went to France. Also part of the teaching team at a church here down in Matthews. Last week, obviously, was Easter. I hope you had an amazing time celebrating. I was with my family in Virginia celebrating Easter. And next week, Casey's going to come back and continue teaching through the book of Acts. And what I want to do this morning is build a bit of a bridge to move us from Easter to Acts. A bit of a bridge that kind of moves us from what we experienced last week and the incredible truth of Jesus crucified and risen from the dead, and then how this thing starts to happen in Acts, how people empowered by the Spirit start to move out and carry this message of Easter. Because I think the interesting thing is, whether you've been hanging around a church or not, we can sometimes not sure what to do with Easter. I mean, we put a lot of energy into Easter, as we should. You take away Easter, you take away the heartbeat of the Christian faith. But sometimes we get to the end of Easter and we're like, okay, I can finally catch a breath. What do we do now? And especially in me and when I was in full-time ministry, that was the deal. We poured a lot of energy into Easter. Here's an example of my Easter weekend in France. It would begin probably on a Friday night. We would gather in the home of some friends of ours and do a Seder meal, which Jesus and his followers, and we're going to participate in a degree of that here this morning. We would do a 3 or 4 hour Seder meal on a Friday. The next morning, we would have a family picnic at a nearby park. That night, then we would move and then go set up the space where we were going to meet for Easter celebration the next morning. That next morning, Easter, we'd get there about 6 a.m. and kind of do final preparations to start at 7 because we want to do an Easter sunrise service, which is cool, but it's early. I mean, let's be honest. So when we got there at 6 and then did that for 7, preached there, had an incredible time of worship, then most of us would gather and then go back into town to a French church that we had a great relationship with, and we would worship with them. That would end around noon. Then all Protestant churches would gather in the kind of a central town square in front of the cathedral, and kind of an ecumenical Protestant Catholic gathering. They'd set up a stage, and we would do some readings and prayers together as people of faith, proclaiming that Jesus has risen from the dead, proclaiming that to the city. It's a beautiful experience. While that was over, we then went to a friend's house and had a 3 or 4 hour meal, as you do in Europe, a centerpieced by a lamb, and we had a great afternoon. The next day, we would gather our church and hike up a mountain because Easter Monday was a day off and a holiday for France. That's exhausting. It's exhausting even me telling you that. I'm like, oh man, what were we thinking? But we should. I mean, Easter does deserve that. But I think part of the challenge, I don't want to say danger, but part of the challenge is we get to the end of whatever that is for you, and you kind of go, okay, that's good, now what? And so what I want to do this morning, I think Easter sets something in motion, and I think if we're going to join what God has set in motion from Easter, it's going to require something, and I think that piece, that bridge, moving us from Easter to what's next, moving us from Easter to what Easter sets in motion, joining the work of God in the world, I think it comes down to 2 words. And we're going to see these 2 words in a story where Jesus has an interaction with one of his closest and most passionate disciples. If you have a Bible or a phone or iPad, or you can turn or tap to John chapter 21 is where we're going to be this morning. It will also be on the screen, the version I'm reading, the New English translation will be up on the screen. I want to walk us through this story, and I think what Jesus has to say to Peter is going to be for us that bridge. It's going to be that piece that can move us from what we experienced last week to join what God has set in motion because of Easter. And to be a part of some of these stories, to be a part of what God's doing in the world, not only back in that day through Acts, but also in our day here and now. So as you turn there, I just want to say a quick word of prayer, and then we'll move forward. God, thank you for your word. Thank you for those who have labored and strived through the centuries for your word to be accessible. Thank you for the churches all over the city, all over this country, and all over the world who in this very moment are doing this exact thing. We lift up the name of Jesus and ask Holy Spirit for your direction and guidance in the word. In Jesus' name, amen. John chapter 21, beginning in verse 1. After this, Jesus revealed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias, or also Galilee. Now this is how he did so. Simon Peter, Thomas called Didymus, Nathanael who was from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and two other disciples. I like that. They didn't even make the story. Just two other guys were there. Simon Peter told them, verse 3, I am going fishing. They replied, we will go with you. And they went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. So it's after Easter. It's kind of in this in-between time between Easter and Acts. And Jesus has kind of shown up to his disciples. They've had the empty tomb and all that stuff. And here are 7 out of the 11 disciples. Remember, Judas exit stage left. 7 of the 11 disciples are gathered together on the Sea of Galilee fishing. Now that's interesting, but it was also very familiar for them. Many of them were professional fishermen. This was the place where they had spent their growing up years learning to do what they were doing, fishing. But it's also kind of interesting, I think, because here we just had Easter. Here they just Peter ran to the empty tomb, looked in the tomb, body wasn't there, but you almost get this sense they're unsure now what to do. So they had Easter, and here they are going fishing. They're out all night, the story goes on, verse 5. They're out all night, don't catch anything. And then, kind of near daybreak, someone is out there standing on the shore. They're about 100 yards out, and someone says, hey, why don't you try throwing your nets over the right side of the boat? Now, when I read the Bible, I kind of try to put myself into position of how people would respond in certain situations. I'm glad I wasn't there, because having been out all night, having caught nothing, having done what I do professionally and actually failed at it, and then have someone come along and say, hey, did you try that? I probably wouldn't have had polite words to say to that person. Oh, no, sorry, we've been out all night throwing over the left side. That's a brilliant idea. No, we didn't try the right side at all. They didn't say that, by the way. You can look. Yeah, like I said, I'm glad I wasn't there. They say, even despite being out there all night catching nothing, they obey this guy. And this wasn't that uncommon. People would do this on the Sea of Galilee. So they obey, and they throw the net over, and they get this huge amount of fish. And when they do that, they realize something has happened. And particularly John, who's writing this gospel, turns to Peter and says, hey, Peter, that guy on the shore, 100 yards away, that's Jesus. Peter, not too much out of character if you're familiar with Peter through the gospel stories, kind of shores up his clothes, a little bit of clothes he still has on from working all night, dives into the water. The rest of them are like, we'll just take the boat. And so they take the boat. Peter's swimming you got to read the Bible. This stuff's fascinating. So Peter swims to shore, and he gets there, and Jesus is there. Jesus has set up a fire. Jesus has some fish. He calls him. He says, bring some of that fish in, and they sit down and have breakfast together. Now, that's the setup for where I want to kind of land this morning. I wish we had more time. We could park through some of that, but here's where I want to land this morning, down beginning in verse 15. It's a very familiar passage if you've been hanging around a church for a while, and I think God has a few things for us to hear from it this morning. Beginning verse 15. Then when they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these do? He replied, yes, Lord, you know I love you. Jesus told him, feed my lambs. Jesus said a second time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He replied, yes, Lord, you know I love you. Jesus told him, shepherd my sheep. Jesus said a third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was distressed that Jesus had asked him a third time, "Do you love me?" and said, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." And Jesus replied, "Feed my sheep." Now, this is a huge passage. There are layers, I think, of what's going on. But really, I think for us this morning, I want you to hold on to this. What Jesus is talking about is what it means to be devoted to Him. It's very interesting that he has this conversation with Peter, maybe pulled away slightly from the other group, but within earshot. Peter was one of the most passionate, vibrant disciples. If you have ever read the Gospels, if you haven't, you should, because you'll see Peter jumping out across the page. He does the stuff that most of us would probably be afraid to do, and he gets it wrong often. In fact, the last interaction that Jesus and Peter really had together was the night that Jesus was betrayed. If you're not familiar with the story, Peter's in a courtyard and someone says, "Hey, you're connected with Jesus. You're associated with Him. You're about what He's about." And 3 times Peter denies it and runs off in his shame. That's the last interaction really he's had with Jesus. And so there's a sense maybe in these 3 questions that Jesus is restoring Peter again. But really, I think what he's saying, and maybe that's true as well, but I think what he's saying here is he's talking about what true devotion looks like for Peter, and I think for us as well. 2 things stand out to me from this, or one from this and one from the next set of verses. First is he says, "Hey, Peter, if you're devoted to me, there's going to be a task involved, and it's a task bigger than you ever imagined, Peter." Peter had kind of been living for the last 3 years, following in Jesus' coattails, trying to figure it out, getting in the way a lot of times, sometimes getting it right. And I think Jesus is coming to him and saying, "Look, there's going to be a task. To be devoted for me, Peter, to be devoted to me, Peter, is not just your passion, but you're going to be about the things I'm about. So you're going to be feeding my lambs and shepherding my sheep. You're going to be about the things I'm about." To be devoted to Jesus means to be a part of the work of what Jesus is doing. There's another thing too, down in verse 18, 19. There's going to be a cost, more than Peter imagined. Jesus says this, "I tell you the solemn truth. When you were young, Peter, you tied your clothes around you and went wherever you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands and others will tie you up and bring you where you do not want to go." Now, Jesus had said this to indicate clearly about what kind of death Peter was going to glorify God. To face the task, to take up the task that Jesus was asking Peter to take up, there was going to be a cost involved for Peter. And we know from history that Peter was martyred for his faith. Some say he was crucified. Some say that he was crucified upside down at his own request because he did not feel like he deserved the same kind of death as Jesus. But for Peter, Jesus is looking forward into the future and saying, "Peter, if you want to be devoted to me, if you want to be connected to me, if you really want to follow into this Easter way of life, there's going to be a task involved, and there's also going to be a cost involved." And I think it's a beautiful moment. I think it's Jesus and all of His grace and all of His mercy. I just picture Jesus in this very personal moment with Peter. I don't see Him wagging His finger. I don't see Him standing, so to speak, behind a podium. I see Him in this tender moment having a dialogue with His friends. And I see Him kind of saying, "Peter, to be about what God's doing in this world, got to be connected to me, connected to what I'm doing in the world, and willing to face the costs that it may involve." In order for Peter to face that task and to face that cost, he needed to be devoted to Jesus. So, how does he do that? The second half of verse 19, Jesus says 2 words to Peter, which I think can potentially be our 2 words this morning to move us from what we experienced last week in the movement of that and the power of the Spirit of that from Easter to Acts. And there's 2 words. It says this, after Jesus said this to Peter, Jesus told Peter, "Follow me." Get the sense that Jesus kind of summarizes all that Jesus kind of puts a punctuation on the end of that Peter, this whole thing, this task, this cost to follow me into this new world that Easter has started and inaugurated. The bridge that's going to get you there, Peter, that's going to move you from the lake shore to the cities, 2 words, Peter, follow me. I don't think Jesus was meaning a spatial kind of follow. In other words, Peter, I'm going to walk over in that grass right over there. You need to walk 4 steps behind me all the way. I don't think he's talking spatial so much because he's going to be gone off the earth shortly after this conversation. I think it's much more relational than it is spatial. I think for Peter to follow Jesus meant that his relationship with Jesus would come alive. And the task and the cost, everything that was before him was going to happen in context of relationship to Jesus. In a very beautiful way, and there's a lot in this story that ties back to former conversations and experiences that these guys had together. In a sense, too, Jesus is having a conversation that he had back with Peter at the beginning. You can go back later and read Matthew chapter 4. Matthew chapter 4, Jesus is walking along the shore of the Lake of Galilee, the same lake, and he comes across some guys who are fishing, some of these same guys who are doing this same task on this same lake, and he goes to them in Matthew 4 and says, I see you're fishing, why don't you just drop that and follow me? And so Jesus, in a way, is coming back to where he started with Peter and saying, Peter, you had to go at this for a couple years, but maybe you didn't really get it. Now, Peter, I want to tell you what this looks like. To follow me is to be in relationship with me. It's to join me in the task that God's doing in the world because of Easter. It's being willing to face the cost. All of that, Peter, follow me. It's time for that relationship to come alive now, Peter. I think for us, we can look at a story like that, and we can look at Easter, and we can look at what comes after Easter. We can kind of get in this place of, how do we get from here to there? Or we could get into a danger place where we think we could get from here to there apart from Jesus. We think, yeah, okay, I understand that God has a task in the world. I'll go figure it out. Thank you very much. You wake up in the morning, it's like, all right, I know what I've got to do on my to-do list. God, I'll see you maybe later tonight, maybe later this week, maybe on Sunday. I've got it from here. Thank you very much. I think we sometimes can live in the danger where we think we can do the task apart from Jesus. Or sometimes we think we could face the cost apart from Jesus, and we quickly learn that's not the case. I think the piece for us here this morning that Jesus is saying to Peter that connects with our life and our experience of how to live this day in and day out life of following Jesus into this new Easter world comes back to those 2 words, every day, every moment, follow me. To be in relationship with me, to get the heartbeat of what God the Father, by the power of the Spirit, is doing in the world to proclaim God the Son. So what does that mean for us, and how can we do that? A couple things. I think we can ask a couple questions, one being this. Where has Jesus called you to follow him? Where has Jesus called you to follow him? I think one of the best ways to answer that question for you, for your family, it's a great question you can have around your table at lunch today. Where's Jesus called you to follow him? One of the best ways to do that is just start, honestly, open your eyes. God has put me among people that very few others will ever meet. There are people in your world, there are people who live on your street that your pastors will never meet. I can say that because I'm a pastor. There are people in your workplace that maybe no one else in this room will ever meet. There are places that you have access to that very few people have an opportunity to go. I think one of the best ways to see where God's calling you is you start saying, God, where have you put me, and who are the people that you've put me around? That's where God has called you. I had a great conversation with a friend just last week, actually. She was telling me about an amazing experience she had last month, and she said, I went and spoke to a group of military wives. She said, I'm a military wife. I have 3 sons. They all have wives who are military wives. And most of that group I spoke to had a Catholic background. And she was telling me about how she came from a Catholic background. And she said, so I was able to understand what they were going through. I was able to understand their background. And I was able to tell them about Jesus and speak in such a way that we all connected. And I could watch her, literally her countenance change as she was relaying this story to me. She said these words. She said, "It was my sweet spot." And I know her passion for Jesus, by that translated, means she figured out where Jesus was calling her to follow. There are places and people that God has put you around, that Jesus is calling you to go with the message of new life because of Easter. Second question is this, is where do you need the courage to take up the cost of following Jesus? Where do you need the courage to take up the cost of following Jesus? Sometimes Jesus will call you to places that require cost. And I think, at least my experience in ministry, my experience, just life experience, is that sometimes the hardest cost is that initial step. I've sat with couples, for example, whose marriage, though they give an outward appearance, everything's fine, is falling apart. And I've sat with them where one of them or both of them come to me and say, "You know what, we just need to share this with you because we're ready for someone to help." And you can tell, I can tell in that moment, that right there is probably the hardest step for them. To take that initial step. It's hardest for them just to be honest about what's going on. To put down the facade. Say, "You know what, we believe Jesus is calling us for our marriage to have the life of God. And we're not there. And we need help. We want to help get there." There are places, maybe it's relationally like that. Maybe there's a decision. Maybe God's put something across your path right now and you've got a decision to make about a job or a home. You've got decisions to make before you. And you know what? You know what God's calling you to do, but it's going to cost something. We've all been there. I've been there. And I remember the moment's going to come down to not whether or not that's the right decision, because you know it's the right one, is the moment's going to be, are you willing to face that cost to follow Jesus? What's going to move us from Easter to join in the purpose and the work of God that He has set in motion there, what's going to move us from Easter to Acts is our connectedness, our relationship with Jesus. These guys went from here to this lakeshore into Jerusalem and waited for the Spirit to come, just as Jesus told them it would. They did it all, and they moved out from this point. The church moved out from that point, all because of Jesus. I think we have an incredible experience here this morning to be able to take communion together. It's done in a lot of different ways in France. I did it in a bunch of different ways, a bunch of different experiences across a bunch of different churches. But I'm always so struck by the experience of communion. Because it's one of those things, it doesn't matter what church background you may have come from. Churches all over say, this is one of those things that we're going to do because Jesus told us to do. And it proclaims something about Jesus. It proclaims something about what He's done on the cross, what He did at Easter, what He's doing now in the world. It proclaims something about His call for us to be connected in relationship with Him, not because somehow we figured it out, not because He looked at us and it's like, everyone in this room, we're good. It's something because of His sacrifice and Him being willing to face the cost of the cross, that He offers a relationship to us. Humanity went haywire after the garden. Sin entered the world, and human beings just said, we're going to live however we want outside of the design of God. And God, in incredible mercy and grace, came to us at Easter. His Son paying the penalty for that sin, for that life outside of the design of God, and offering us new life and calling us to participate in the work of God that Easter has set in motion. I wonder today if you need to answer that question, if you need to answer that statement, if you need to respond to that, to follow me. I wonder if that just presses in somewhere for you. Maybe I've been talking and you're like, can you just shut up for a while? Because I got a story in my mind and I know God's stirring that, and that's great. Write that down. Let God continue to stir that. I imagine for most of us here this morning, there's something where we're going through this and this connectedness and following Jesus that speaks to a story in your life right now. And I hope during this holy act, this church uniting, celebrated act of communion, that you would allow God in His power and His grace to continue to speak to that. That you would be willing to follow Jesus. I ask Reverend Dr. Gilbert to come on up, please, to the table, and the band as well, and then we're going to take communion together as a church, and he'll lead us in those elements.